Morning, everyone. Good to be with you this morning. We're going to look at Dominion by Tom Holland, and then we're going to I'll do some quotes from Morality by Jonathan Sacks. As a kind of brief, trying to think how this all fits together. Tom Holland looks at the way that Western thought historically has been formed by Christianity, and we've generally forgotten that. And then I think Jonathan Sacks looks at the way that a lot of the things that we hold so valuable are actually being undermined by current trends, and his call for morality and culture that allows morality to thrive. But we'll start with Dominion. I can thoroughly recommend both books. I really enjoyed reading both of them. Dominion was published in 2019. Tom Holland was born in 1968. He studied at Cambridge. And the book is described like this by the Guardian newspaper: an absorbing survey of Christianity's subversive origins and enduring influence it's filled with vivid portraits, gruesome deaths, and moral debates. I'm afraid you're not going to get the full gamut of those vivid portraits, gruesome deaths, and moral debates. Do read the book, though. It is full of them and a great read. Just to give you some orientation around the book and kind of his thought behind it. He wrote an article for the New Statesman magazine in 2016, and he said this. He said, familiarity with the biblical narrative of the crucifixion has dulled our sense of just how completely novel a deity Christ was. Christianity is the principal reason, by and large, most of us who live in post-Christian societies still take for granted it is nobler to suffer than inflict suffering. It is why we generally assume that every human life is of equal value. In my morals and ethics, I've learned to accept that I'm not Greek or Roman at all, but thoroughly and proudly Christian. Although when asked whether he was a Christian at a conference in the UK, he said he was on the diving board looking down and hadn't yet taken the plunge. His father was an atheist and his mother was an Anglican, I think a devout Anglican. So that's a little bit background to Tom Holland. As he mentioned there, the book begins with the incredible place of the crucifixion in history, and then informing and shaping what goes. And the way I'm going to do both these reviews is I'm just going to give you lots of quotes, and I've left out obviously 99.9% of the book and just chosen ones that hopefully have some sense of narrative as we work through. So he starts with saying how the crucifixion was absolutely abhorrent to the Romans. So everything about the practice of nailing a man to a crux, was repellent. Why, the very word is harsh in our ears. It was this disgust that crucifixion uniquely inspired, which explained why, when slaves were condemned to death, they were executed in the meanest, wretchedest stench of land beyond the city walls, and why, when Rome burst its ancient limits, only the world's most exotic and aromatic plants could serve to mask the taint. It was also why, despite the ubiquity of crucifixion across the Roman world, few cared to think much about it. The order loved by the gods and upheld by magistrates vested with the full authority of the greatest power on earth, was what counted, not the elimination of such vermin as presumed to challenge it. And the vermin obviously dying by crucifixion. And then he goes on to speak about how unbelievable it was to Romans and to Jews that Jesus is then worshipped. So he says this: divinity then was for the very greatest of the great, for victors and heroes and kings. Its measure was the power to torture one's enemies, not to suffer it oneself. That a man who had himself been crucified might be hailed as a god could not help but be seen by people everywhere across the Roman world as scandalous, obscene, grotesque. That such a God of all gods might have had a son, and that his son, suffering the fate of a slave, might have been tortured to death on a cross, were claims as stupefying as they were to most Jews repellent. No more shocking a reversal of their most devoutly held assumptions could possibly have been imagined. Not mere blasphemy, it was madness. And then fast forward, he comments how 4 centuries later, the view of the cross has changed. It appears in art. It becomes an emblem, a badge of honor. Eventually, the cross becomes the most globally recognized symbol of a God there has ever been. And even time itself is measured by him. And he then charts how Christianity, the influence of Christianity, is even today inescapable. And I'm going to look at language ideas of values, on marriage, on human rights, and the way that he describes it. So firstly, the influence of Christianity inescapable on language and ideas. He says this: 2,000 years on from the birth of Christ, it does not require a belief that he rose from the dead to be stamped by the formidable, indeed the inescapable, influence of Christianity. Whether it be the conviction that the workings of conscience are the surest determinants of good law, or that church and state exist as distinct entities, or that polygamy is unacceptable, its trace elements are to be found everywhere in the West. To even write about it in a Western language is to use words shot through with Christian connotations. Religion, secular, atheist, none of these are neutral. All, though they derive from the classical past, come freighted with a legacy of Christendom. Fail to appreciate this, and the risk is always of anachronism. And he goes on to speak about Christianity's influence on the way we see values. He goes on to say, lepers and slaves were not the most defenseless of God's children. Across the Roman world, wailing at the sides of roads or on rubbish tips, babies abandoned by their parents were a common sight. Others might be dropped down drains, there to perish in their hundreds. The odd eccentric philosopher aside, few had ever queried this practice. Indeed, there were cities who by ancient law had made a positive virtue of it, condemning to death deformed infants for the good of the state. Sparta, one of the most celebrated cities in Greece, had been the epitome of this policy, and Aristotle himself had lent the full weight of his prestige. Girls in particular were liable to be winnowed ruthlessly. Those who were rescued from the wayside would invariably be raised as slaves. Brothels were full of women as infants who, as infants, had been abandoned by their parents, so much so that it had long provided novelists with a staple of their fiction. Only a few peoples, the odd German tribe, inevitably the Jews, had stood aloof from the exposure of unwanted children. Pretty much everyone else had always taken it for granted, until that was the emergence of a Christian people. This week, Richard Dawkins said that he thought all people with Down syndrome should be aborted before birth, and Tom Holland stepped into the fray on Twitter, I noticed. Next, the inescapable influence of Christianity on marriage. Here in this sacral understanding of marriage was another marker of the revolution that Christianity had brought to the erotic. The insistence of Scripture that a man and a woman, whenever they took to the marital bed, were joined as Christ and his church were joined, becoming one flesh, gave to both a rare dignity. If the wife was instructed to submit to her husband, then so equally the husband was instructed to be faithful to his wife. Here, by the standards of the age into which Christianity had been born, was an obligation that demanded an almost heroic degree of self-denial. That Roman law, unlike the Talmud and unlike the customs of most other ancient peoples, defined marriage as a monogamous institution, had not for a moment meant that it required men to display lifelong fidelity. Husbands had enjoyed a legal right to divorce and, of course, to forcing themselves on their inferiors pretty much as they pleased. This was why, in its long struggle and arduous struggle to trammel the sexual appetites of Christians, the church had made marriage the particular focus of its attentions. The double standards for that for so long had been a feature of marital ethics, had come to be sternly patrolled. Joined together under the watchful eye of Christ, men were commanded to be as faithful to their wives as their wives were to them. Divorce, except in the very rarest of circumstances, was prohibited. To cast off a wife was to render her an adulteress, so Jesus himself had declared. The bonds of a Christian marriage, mutual and indissoluble as they were, served to join man and woman together as they had never been joined before. So the influence of Christianity on marriage being so countercultural, and then our whole notion of human rights, he says, is fundamentally comes from a Christian understanding. He says this about secularism and human rights. Secularism and human rights, it was claimed, existed naturally within the fabric of things. Yet this, of course, was quite as fantastical a belief as anything to be found in the Bible. The evolution of the concept of human rights, mediated as it had been since the Reformation by Protestant jurists and philosophers, had had come to obscure its original authors. It derived not from ancient Greece or Rome, but from the period of history condemned by all right-thinking revolutionaries as a lost millennium, in which any hint of enlightenment had at once been snuffed out by monkish, book-burning fanatics, presumably the Dark Ages. It was an inheritance from the canon lawyers of the Middle Ages. And then he goes on to speak more about the whole notion of secularism, and then we'll look at fascism and Christian response to that. So secularism, the great claim of what in 1946 an English newspaper editor first termed secularism, was to neutrality, yet this was a conceit. Secularism was not a neutral concept. The very word came trailing incense clouds of meaning that were irrevocably and venerably Christian. That there existed twin dimensions, the secular and the religious, was an assumption that reached back centuries beyond the Reformation to Gregory VII, to Columbanus, and to Augustine. The concept of secularism, for all that was promoted by the editor who invented the word as an antidote to religion, testified not to Christianity's decline, but to its seemingly infinite capacity for evolution. And then I'm fast forwarding now to the early 20th century and going to look at fascism and the ongoing influence of secularism all the way down to 2011 and the Charlie Hebdo issue in Paris. So fascism. As in Italy, so in Germany, fascism worked to combine the glamour and the violence of antiquity with that of the modern world. There was no place in this vision of the future for the mewling feebleness of Christianity. Hitler, who in 1928 had loudly proclaimed his movement to be Christian, had come to regard Christianity with active hostility. Its morality, its concern for the weak, he'd always viewed as cowardly and shameful. Now that he was in power, he recognized in the claim of the church to a sphere distinct from the state, that venerable inheritance from the Gregorian Revolution. He recognized in it a direct challenge to the totalitarian mission of National Socialism. Christians, confronted by a regime committed to the repudiation of the most fundamental tenets of their faith, the oneness of the human race, the obligation of care for the weak and the suffering, had a choice to make. Did the church, as a pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer had put it as early as 1933, have an unconditional obligation towards the victims of any social order, even where those victims do not belong to the Christian community, or did it not? Bonhoeffer's own answer to that question would see him conspire against Hitler's life and end up being hanged in a concentration camp. There were many other Christians too who passed the test. Some spoke out publicly, others more clandestinely did what they could to shelter Jewish neighbors in cellars and attics, in the full awareness that to do so was to risk their own lives. The tradition in which they stood of satire, of blasphemy, of desecration was not a repudiation of Christian history, but its very essence. For 500 years, Catholics had repeatedly been obliged to test their faith against it. Now it was the turn of the Muslims. In 2011, a cartoon of Muhammad appeared on the cover of Charlie Hebdo. The following year, he was depicted crouching on all fours, his genitals bared. The mockery would not cease. So Charlie Hebdo's editor vowed, until Islam has been rendered as banal as Catholicism. This it was in a secular society for Muslims to be treated as equals, except that they were not being treated as equals. Only those who believed in the foundation myths of secularism, that it emerged as though from a virgin birth and that it owed nothing to Christianity, that it was neutral between all religions, could possibly have believed that they were. In January 2015, after 2 gunmen had forced their way into the Charlie Hebdo offices and shot dead 12 of the staff, Muslim sensitivities were repeatedly weighed in the balance by a bewildered and frightened public and found wanting. Why the murderous overreaction to a few cartoons? Why, when Catholics had again and again demonstrated themselves capable of swallowing blasphemies directed against their faith, could Muslims not do the same? Was it not time for Islam to grow up and enter the modern world just as Christianity had done? Yet to ask these questions was, of course, to buy into the core conceit of secularism, that all religions were essentially the same. It was to assume that they were bound, much like butterflies, to replicate an identical life cycle: reformation, enlightenment, decline. Above all, it was to ignore the degree to which the tradition of secularism upheld by Charlie Hebdo, far from an emancipation of Christianity, was indelibly a product of it. 3 days after the shootings, as world leaders marched alongside millions of demonstrators through the heart declared solidarity with the murdered journalist Je suis Charlie. As a spectacle, it was a powerful demonstration of what had become the West's guiding orthodoxy, one that had been millennia in the evolving. Back in the age of Otto, there had been no settling in Christendom for pagan chiefdoms without baptism. Now, in the age of Charlie Hebdo, Europe had new expectations, new identities, new ideals. None, though, was neutral. None was anything other than the fruit of Christian history. To imagine otherwise, to imagine that the values of secularism might indeed be timeless, was, ironically enough, the surest evidence of just how deeply Christian they were. So there you have a very inadequate, but hopefully a taste of Dominion by Tom Holland, and the way he traces the phenomenal impact of the crucifixion on the whole of history unfolding as Christianity spreads, and a whole new set of values around everything. And even now, our response to that is deeply Christian. He does quite a lot on Nietzsche that ends up towards the section on Hitler, and I just picked the secularism section at the end. So I think Tom Holland says things that we hold valuable in Western society are actually far from being generic and part of being humanity, are fundamentally and deeply human. And then what I think Jonathan Sacks does as we move on to morality is I think he is bemoaning the fact that we are losing what is so valuable now in society that's come as part of that heritage. And his book is called Morality. It was published in 2020. Sadly, Jonathan Sacks died last year, age 72, and he was the chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth, so chief rabbi in the UK and of the Commonwealth. And this book has been described by the Independent newspaper as a summation of his life's work. And I really enjoyed reading this book, even more than Dominion, I think. Both of them, so obviously Jonathan Sacks is a Jew, very sympathetic, certainly with a Christian worldview, although it doesn't quite get, obviously, to Christ. And Tom Holland wouldn't describe himself as a Christian, but very sympathetic to Christian values. So Jonathan Sacks' book opens with these words. Societal freedom cannot be sustained by market economics and liberal democratic politics alone. It needs a third element, morality, a concern for the welfare of others, an active commitment to justice and compassion, a willingness to ask not just what is good for me, but what is good for all of us together. It is about us, not me, about we, not I. And he basically says that a coherent culture is essential for morality, and he uses Philip Rief's description of culture. Philip Rief said, culture is another name for a design of motives directing the self outward towards those communal purposes in which alone the self can be realized and satisfied. And this is what was now being systematically abandoned in pursuit of what he called, that is Philip Rief called, the triumph of the therapeutic. And when he tries to describe what has happened to culture, he says this: for me, the most persuasive is Alasdair MacIntyre and his masterwork After Virtue, in which he argued that though we continue to use moral language, we have, very largely, if not entirely, lost our comprehension, both theoretical and practical, of morality. All we possess, he said, is disconnected fragments of what was once a coherent view of the world and our place within it. He ended the book with a warning of the coming ages of barbarism and darkness. And then Jonathan goes on to explain his understanding of what morality is and what then will happen if we lose it. Love your neighbor, love the stranger. Hear the cry of the otherwise unheard. Liberate the poor from their poverty. Care for the dignity of all. Let those who have more than they need share their blessings with those who have less. Feed the hungry, house the homeless, and heal the sick in body and mind. Fight injustice, whoever it is done by and whoever it's done against. And do these things because, being human, we are bound by a covenant of human solidarity, whatever our color or culture, class or creed. These are moral principles, not economic or political ones. They have to do with conscience, not with wealth or power. But without them, freedom will not survive. The free market and liberal democratic state together will not save liberty, because liberty can never be built by self-interest alone. I-based societies all eventually die. Morality is not an option, it's an essential. If we focus on the I and lose the we, if we act on self-interest without a commitment to the common good, if we focus on self-esteem and lose our care for others, we will lose much else. Nations will cease to have societies and instead have identity groups. We will lose our feeling of collective responsibility and find in its place a culture of competitive victimhood. In an age of unprecedented possibilities, people will feel vulnerable and alone. The market will be merciless. Politics will be deceiving, divisive, confrontational, and extreme. People will feel anxious, uncertain, fearful, aggressive, unstable, unrooted, and unloved. They will focus on promoting themselves instead of the one thing that will give them lasting happiness, making life better for others. People will be, by historical standards, financially rich, but emotionally poor. Freedom itself will be at risk from the far right and the far left. The far right dreaming of a golden age that never was, the far left dreaming of utopia that will never be. One of the things about Jonathan Sacks' writing is it is beautiful. And he quotes many people. I've left many of his references out to try and give you his thoughts as we go through. But here's an example of when he quotes some of the vast reading that he's done. It's coming now to morality being essential for freedom. Morality is essential to freedom. That is what John Locke meant when he contrasted liberty, the freedom to do what we ought, with license, the freedom to do what we want. Is what Adam Smith signaled when, before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, he wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments. It is what George Washington meant when he said human rights can only be assured among a virtuous people. And Benjamin Franklin when he said, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. Or Thomas Jefferson when he said, a nation as a society forms a moral person and every member of its personality responsible for his society. Lose morality and eventually you will lose liberty. And he goes on to say you cannot outsource morality to the market or the state because they operate on different principles. He says, imagine if you have 100 shares and you decide to give 90 away in the market, you're left only with 10%. And he goes on to make this point. Wealth and power operate by division. The more we share, the less we have. Imagine, though, now that you have a certain measure of influence or friendship or knowledge or love, and you decide to share that with 9 others. You do not have less, you may have more. That is because these are social goods, goods that exist by sharing. These are goods that have a moral or spiritual dimension, and they have this rare quality that the more we share, the more we have. He talks about quite a bit in the book towards kind of 2/3 of the way through, what does it mean to be human? And he, not surprisingly, bases our humanity on relationships. And these are some excerpts from that. It ties in, obviously, with his whole theory around morality. whole push for morality. The human condition is overwhelmingly about relationships, about faithfulness, staying true, loyal and committed to one another despite all the tensions, setbacks, misunderstandings, backslidings, and all the multiple ways in which we fall short. It is about consecrating the bonds between us. It is about transcending our solitude. To be fully human, we need direct encounters with other human beings. We have to be in their presence, open to their otherness, alert to their hopes and fears, engaged in the minuet of conversation, the delicate back and forth of speaking and listening. That is how relationships are made. That is how we become moral beings. That is how we learn to think as we. He traces the undermining of our current understanding of morality and the Christian understanding back to Nietzsche, as in fact Tom Holland does in his book Dominion. And this is how Jonathan Sacks puts it. Nietzsche was the first to proclaim that God is dead and we have killed him. So radical was the assertion that he put it in the mouth of an imaginative madman in The Gay Science. But he was far more than merely an atheist. His view was the entire Judeo-Christian moral heritage was nothing less than the revenge of the powerless against the powerful, the retribution exacted by slaves against their former masters. It was a sustained exercise in resentiment. Everything we'd come to think of as virtue, compassion, kindness, was in fact a way of caging, neutering the reality of human nature, which was, he believed, shaped and dominated by the will to power. In the competition for power, most people fail, but some succeed and impose their will on others. Such a person Nietzsche called the Übermensch. Christianity opposed this way of life in the name of justice and equality. But Nietzsche believed that the Christian era was at an end, and rightly so, because in returning to nature, we would find ourselves returning to the world of epic heroes of the pre-Socratic world of the Greeks. Nietzsche did not say what would happen to the rest of us in a world ruled by pre-Socratic heroes, but the short answer must be that it was not his concern. For Nietzsche, winners count, losers do not. A world ruled by the will to power is not a moral world as we recognize it. He goes on later, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche between them effectively destroyed the foundations of morality as they had been known in the West for many centuries, and each proposed in its place a profoundly personal, subjective vision of the moral life, in which choice was the essence. Not choice as it had always been known between good and evil as defined by the prevailing culture, but rather to define good and evil themselves in an act involving the totality of one's being. The I had become not just the principal character in the moral drama, but its author, the writer of its rules. The end result was an ethic without agreed principles or objective truths. It was a world of relativism, subjectivism, and a new and dominant idea, namely authenticity, or as it's sometimes called, expressive individualism. The moral imperative, different in substance for each of us, is to become ourselves. And then he goes on to look at some of the contemporary threats to morality, and I'm going to give you a few quotes around populism and identity politics, very relevant for us today. He says this: populist politics involves magical thinking, the belief that a strong leader with contempt for democratic processes, divisive rhetoric, relaxed about the truth or otherwise of his or her utterances, ignoring the conventions of normal politics, appealing directly to the people, blaming the state of the nation on some subgroup of the nation, or perhaps on neighboring nations and peoples, and speaking not to the better angels of our nature, but to our worst, can restore a nation's former greatness. That is magical thinking. Identity politics is a clear and present danger to liberal democracy. It fragments the body politic and balkanizes society. It discourages talk about the common good. It can quickly turn into the politics of grievance and competitive victimhood. This creates a vicious cycle of social divisions, leading to divisive politics that deepen and harden social divisions. It is one of the causes of the us versus them mentality that leads to populism, which itself, as we have seen, is a warning signal of democracy in danger. Identity politics deepens the fragmentation caused by multiculturalism, adding to it not just culture and ethnicity, but also other forms of identity based on gender and sexual orientation. There is a real danger here of splitting society into self-segregating, non-communicating ghettos. One of its axioms is that only a member of my group can understand my pain. It is the very opposite of Terence's dictum, I think nothing human alien to me. Over 300 years, the West has, with some success, developed an ethic of tolerance and respect for difference. And in a liberal society, prejudice and discrimination that undoubtedly still exists are to be fought wherever they occur. But that is precisely incompatible with an identity politics that builds walls around minorities, allowing no one else to enter, and at the same time insist on recognition from the wider society. As Mark Liller told students at Rutgers University in 2016, you cannot tell people simultaneously, you must understand me and you cannot understand me. This reaction against liberal individualism, like 19th century reactions against Enlightenment universalism, will end in tragedy. It turns difference into exclusion and suspicion. It builds walls, not bridges. It abdicates the hard work of understanding, respecting, and working with and for the people not like us. It encourages a mindset of victimhood and oppression. It abandons ideas of the common ground and the common good. The identity politics of the contemporary left, itemized in the 2016 American election campaign into women, Hispanics, ethnic Americans, the LGBT community, Native Americans, African Americans, Pacific Islanders, and 10 other groups, generates its own equal and opposite reaction on the part of the newly resurgent far right. White supremacists in the United States, the National Front in France, the Party for Freedom in Holland, the Alternative for Germany, and the Freedom Party in Austria, alongside the authoritarian governments in Hungary and Poland. One thing you'll notice in morality, Jonathan Sachs, as the chief rabbi, often then references Jewish issues throughout the book, and here's one example. One symptom of political malaise has been the return of anti-Semitism to every country in Europe, to the point at which 40% of Europe's Jews have considered leaving. He then looks at some of the thought foundations behind this and historically traces them. And he talks about the hermeneutics of suspicion as being what has led to this in the new way we understand things. The spread of post-truth then has as much to do with the new media of instantaneous global communication, but it also has wider intellectual context. The first relates to the world of Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, given the generic name by Paul Ricoeur as the hermeneutics of suspicion. This was the idea that beneath any apparent communication, something else is going on. There is a subtext beneath the text. For Marx, it was the powerful concretizing of their power. For Nietzsche, it was the weak taking their revenge against the strong. For Freud, it was the subterranean currents of unconscious drives. But for all three, what was said was less important than what was beneath what was said. Truth was a mere mask concealing the realities of power. The entire thrust of postmodernism, inspired by Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, is to develop a hermeneutics of suspicion in which there is no truth, only victory. Every argument is a concealed exercise of power, an attempt to establish the hegemonic discourse. Judaism rejects this idea, not because it's never true, in the case of an argument, not for the sake of heaven it is, but because we can tell when it is and when it isn't. There is such a thing as truth and collaborative argument in pursuit of it. That is the basis of trust on which all genuine communication depends. There is everything to be said for a politics that strives for equal opportunity and human dignity. But there is a great difference between a future-oriented politics and one that focuses on grievances of the past, between a culture that emphasizes responsibility and one constructed around an ever-expanding notion of rights, between one that defines people as victims and one that helps genuine victims to recover their capacity for action and self-determination. Politics is about power and the distribution of resources. It is not about the psychology of self-esteem or the allocation of blame. When these boundaries are blurred, the result is deeply damaging to the good group relations on which an ethnically and religiously diverse society depend. One of the things he tackles as well as part of this malaise is the way we understand what it means to be human. And again, there's huge chapters on it. And here's just a few comments from that. The loss of dignity is deeply embedded in popular science today. We've become the naked ape, a gene's way of making another gene, a data processing algorithm, an organism among organisms, without freedom or virtue, neither sacred nor unique. Reviewing this history of the descent of man, it is hard not to feel that we have lost more than we have gained. For what does it profit humanity if it gains the whole world, yet loses its soul? Spinoza, who taught us that to the extent that we are physical beings, we are subject to physical laws, all of which have the character of necessity. Therefore, freedom, God's gift to humanity that separated us from the animals, is an illusion. There is, in fact, only one form of freedom, the consciousness of necessity. The philosopher grows wise by knowing that things could not have been otherwise. Science cannot, in and of itself, give an account of human dignity because dignity is based on human freedom. Freedom is a concept that lies outside the scope of science. Science cannot locate freedom because the scientific world is one of causal relationships. A stone is not free to fall or not to fall. Lightning does not choose when and where to strike. A scientific law links one physical phenomenon to another without the intervention of will and choice. To the extent that there is a science of human behavior, there is an implicit denial of the freedom of that human behavior. That is precisely what Spinoza, Marx, and Freud were arguing, that freedom is an illusion. But if freedom is an illusion, then so too is human dignity based on that freedom. Science cannot but deconsecrate the human person, thereby opening the gate to a possible desecration. And then lastly, his solution on what we need to look for and strive for comes in the word covenant. And he contrasts it in these last paragraphs with contract. Self-interest generates contract. In a contract, two or more individuals, each pursuing their own advantage, come together to make an exchange for mutual benefit. I pay my garage mechanic to mend my car. I and others pay our taxes to ensure that we have the social services we need. So there is the commercial contract that creates the market and the social contract that creates the state. But in both cases, the motivating factor is of interest. Factor is of interest. Contracts are about I. A covenant generates a different kind of relationship altogether. Recall that what makes it different is that in covenant, two or more individuals, each respecting the dignity and integrity of the other, come together in a bond of love and trust to share their interests, sometimes even to share their lives by pledging their faithfulness to one another, to do together what neither can achieve alone. Unlike contracts, which are entered into for the sake of advantage, covenants are covenants. They are moral commitments, sustained by loyalty and fidelity, even when they call for sacrifice. They're about you and I coming together to form a we. A covenant creates a moral community. It binds people together in a bond of mutual responsibility. It can be vast. There is, I believe, a covenant of human solidarity that binds all 7 billion of us alive today to act responsibly towards the environment, human rights, and the alleviation of poverty for the sake of generations not yet born. A covenant can also be small and personal. The simplest instance is a marriage when a husband and wife pledges themselves to one another in an open-ended commitment to share a life. My firm belief is that the concept of covenant has the power to transform the world. It sees relationships in terms not of interests, but of moral commitment. It changes everything it touches, from marriage to friendship to economics and politics, by turning self-interested individuals into a community in pursuit of the common good. There you go. A very inadequate covering of two great books with some incredible thoughts and encouragements.